Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the session about the City Prosperity Index. I don't know how many of you have heard about the City Prosperity Index, which was developed by UN Habitat in 2012. It is a tool that UN Habitat is using to monitor policies, creating a breadth of knowledge about what is working and what's not working in cities to produce prosperity for everyone and for every single citizen. Now, before we start, I would like to present the speakers here in the session. Let me start with Eduardo Moreno. He's an architect and urban planner, the head of the Research and Capacity Development Branch. He's been with UN Habitat for many years. He was the head of the State of the City, the World Cities Report. And Eduardo Moreno has been always associated with hardcore data in UN Habitat, particularly because he was also before the head of the Global Urban Observatory that gathers all the information about cities in the world. We have on the extreme of our table Daria Chernikova from the Center for Urban Studies and Regional Development, Laboratory for Comparative Research in Quality of Life of National Research, the Tomics State University. She's a PhD in Social Philosophy on Communication Management, in social energetics. Her working experience has been mostly in the international relations areas of the university. So we have an agreement of cooperation with Tomics University, and they are adapting the CPI to the Russian conditions and have started a very interesting cutting-edge work here in the Russian Federation. So, and my name is Claudio Scioli. I'm the head of the Capacity Building Unit of UN Habitat, and my role will be the moderator. And before I start, I would like to ask you to join us in a very interesting survey we're going to do with you. First, I want you to get your phone and go to this website here and type that code. So www.menti.com, and when you see the area for the code, you type 521378. So we're talking about technology here in this forum, how technology can help cities to be more efficient in their relationship with citizens. So here we are, we're using your mobile to communicate and share your vision about certain issues on prosperity. So if you are connected, I will ask my colleague to go ahead to the next slide. So here is a question, and it is in Russian. So the interpreters will be reading for you. In order to turn my city into a prosperous city, I would improve A, the city productivity and its economic basis so that it can produce more and better jobs. B, the city infrastructure to enhance mobility and connectivity. C, the city's public space to enhance community involvement and social cohesion. D, the equity and inclusion of the city so that development is achieved by all inhabitants. E, the city environment to enhance sustainability and protection of the environmental assets of the city. So I can see very clearly here that you have a spread opinion with two answers here on 30%, which I will put my translator, and it's very interesting because why are we asking you this question? And we asking you this question because this is exactly the question, one of the questions we asked before we define what is prosperity. So we researched 60 cities, we spoke to inhabitants, to experts, mayors, decision makers, about the same question we asked you. What is that makes your city prosperous? So some of you believe it's the economic diversity and power. Some of you believe there is investment in infrastructure. And some of you believe that is about sustainability, environmental sustainability. And there is a small group that believes it's about inclusion. Well, we asked a number of these questions to people around the world to define what are the dimensions of prosperity. Now I'm going for a second question, and then we close and I give the floor to my colleague to unpack the issue of prosperity. And here is another question. Which factor is the most influential in creating an environment for your city to be more prosperous? A, elected local officials. B, decentralization policies and appropriate laws and regulations. C, policies to stimulate public transport and mobility. D, policies and practice that promoted participation of civil society. E, a system that creates equal opportunities for all. F, widespread access to basic services and social amenities. G, efficient urban planning and urban management. And H, other. So I can see very clearly here that so participation of civil society and efficient urban planning seems to be what you believe would make a difference for your city to be prosperous. So this is the kind of survey that we carried out in the 60 cities before we actually define the index. And 5 dimensions. So if you go the next slide, quickly, we can go and show the result. One more question. What is preventing your city from becoming more prosperous? A, lack of appropriate infrastructure. B, high incidence of slums and poverty. C, corruption and poor governance and weak institution. D, high levels of crime or perception of that. High cost of doing business, any other reason. I'm not sure what is the one that majority, if the interpreters could tell me what it reads there. 78.
Corruption, weak governance, and lack of institutionalization. This is the major one. You're welcome.
So in Russia, this seems to be a strong variable for you to consider. Now, if you go the next slide. This is the result of the survey we did in the 60 cities to define what would be a prosperous cities, and these 5 dimensions came as the most important elements that define prosperity. And as we move forward, and you will see in the presentation of Eduardo Moreno, you will notice that we had included a 6th corner of the index. And what is that? The governance, planning, institutions, and law. Many of the partners of UN Habitat argued with Eduardo and colleagues that were leading the index, saying this should not be the conduit of the index, but one of the variables to define prosperity. So with that, we moved on and we created the index, and there is an incredible evolution since then. So I want to thank you for your participation in the live survey, and I give the floor now to Eduardo.
Good morning to all of you. Let me walk with you on the City Prosperity Index and the initiative, how it was created, adding some things to what Claudio said. I'm not going to repeat. He was very clear, explaining how it's been used and showing some of the advantages in his use in different countries and cities in the world. Who has to change this? You will. Oh, yes. Okay, let me start with this. 2012, it was a journalist question in one of our conference in which we were presenting our most important report that is called the State of the World Cities. And the question that we were asked is, how do you know which city is more sustainable and more prosperous? How do you know that the policies that are being implemented in the city will have some long-lasting, sustainable results? And the reality is that we really didn't know. Put it in this term, which city in Russia will be today more sustainable, and under which criteria you will decide that, which will be more prosperous. So we decided to create this index in that time with several objectives, very specific objectives. Some of them were not only to collect data and to analyze information, but to produce, and you will see why it's the importance of this, spatial indicators that will help us to understand the city as a moving organ system that the space itself can conspire or can benefit prosperity. We produce reports, we do policy analysis with all this, and this is the way the City Prosperity Index was created as a United Nations, it's a United Nations UN Habitat platform for decision-making in cities. Claudio already explained, I'm not going to repeat. You can see on your left part of the screen the 6 dimensions that integrate prosperity. And we used prosperity and sustainability at that time. There was a moment that we thought we should call it the City Sustainability Index. But the reality is that when we asked people in this survey, they were inclined to tell us that it was better to talk about prosperity than sustainability. Sustainability being very elusive, very fluid concept that was not clear to understand in different ways. So what we do with this index, on your right part of the screen, we can set up baseline information, targets, define some policy tools, and use it as a policy instrument. Oh. It changed very fast, or it doesn't change. The City Prosperity is a sort of roadmap that collects data, transforms this data into knowledge that we call it understanding, and this knowledge into policies that we call it change, policies for change. And then again, we measure what we are doing. It's a very interactive system that connects information to decision making. This thing is not working well. Okay, today the City Prosperity Index and the initiative, let me explain the difference. The index is just a metric. It's based on these 6 dimensions. The initiative is much broader than that. It has to do with policies, It has to do with the best practices. It has to do with training, capacity development, with platforms, with engagement with the population, and with mechanisms for decision making. Today, we are implementing the CPI, as it's called, City Prosperity Initiative, in more than 400 cities in different parts of the world. And you can see here some examples. In Mexico, in Colombia, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia. In some cases, like in Mexico, many cities are being implemented, in China, etc. And we would like that Russia could join the City Prosperity, as today we don't have yet, except Tomsk, that is going to be presented here. Any more cities, and we believe is quite important to do so. The index gives you an aggregated value of the 6 dimensions of prosperity, from 0 to 1. Ideally, 1 that doesn't exist, obviously, as 0 doesn't exist, but the cities that move closer to 1 are the cities that are more prosperous in the world. And those that are lower, normally 30, 40 points, or out of 1.3, let's say, are very low in the prosperity ranking. But we can also separate the dimensions by a specific analysis of each one. For instance, in this case, we analyze cities, prosperity of cities, only on infrastructure. And we can see which city, in this case Oslo, Vienna, Stockholm, etc., are the cities with better infrastructure in the world. And we have the rankings. We can do also another important thing, is to separate the infrastructure dimension, but the subcomponents of the dimension. For instance, housing, social infrastructure, ICT, mobility. Then we can conclude not only which city has better infrastructure, but in which area and why. We can also, obviously we can do that for the 6 dimensions. I'm skipping that just to indicate one. We can do it by regions. Sometimes, if we are frank, it's difficult to compare, and perhaps pointless to compare France or Moscow with one African city, let's say Nairobi or Kampala. So we compare cities that are more in their own region, that have their own challenges and the same opportunities. In this case, you will see the ranking is about only African cities: Nairobi, Cape Town, Accra, Mekelle, etc. And I want to bring to your attention something important. If any of you have traveled or have studied African cities, you will be surprised to see that Cape Town, which is a South African city, is lower in the ranking than Nairobi. And you will say, is the index really working that way? And the response, and this is the importance of the index, is that what is given to us is an indication of the 6 dimensions together. Cape Town is a very vibrant, very productive, very beautiful city, perhaps one of the most beautiful cities in Africa, but it has a main problem, or several problems, but one fundamental. It has the highest inequality in the world, or one of the highest. We have never seen, if you are economists measuring inequalities by Gini coefficient, it's close to 0.6. We have never seen cities reaching that level. And then when you have one dimension that is low, it penalizes the overall index. And this is the way we should see prosperity and sustainability. It's not one dimension that primes over the others, it's the overall integration of all the dimensions. We can also often compare CPI with the Human Development Index, with the GDP in terms of economic growth, and we see clearly, although not necessarily, that there is a correlation or association between prosperity and GDP. But we have seen that secondary cities in many countries could be as prosperous as the large cities. And this is a very interesting conclusion. We can also compare, and you can have this by brackets of GDP or by city size, which is a very interesting analysis. There is no correlation between the dimensions of prosperity and the city size, except one of them, productivity. Cities tend to be more productive as they are larger in terms of population, and this is clear because of domestic markets and development. We use the CPI, as I mentioned, this is in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, 17 cities, and you can compare, you can transform the index into these diagrams and see how cities are performing in specific areas. And we have these colors codes in your right part of the screen that are telling you, compare at the world level, the city prosperity has a great advantage. It can give you measurements in comparison with other cities, but it can give you measurements only for your own city in something that we call basic CPI or expanded or contextual CPI, which is much more profound in terms of indicators and analysis of different things. When you have, here you have the colors are the dimensions. For instance, on your left one, the red are the productivity dimensions. On the right, you have the environmental dimensions. You can see the green dot that is crossing the city, the graph, are the average of the city prosperity in the case of the 17 Saudi cities. And you will see for each city which of the dimensions are defaulting or are very low. For instance, in the case of the blue bars, which are environmental, you can see that participation, accessibility, governance are low. In the right hand, you have economic agglomeration, etc. So very specific analysis that is telling you where the city is doing well, where the city needs some support in terms of policies and analysis. When we find, and this is the case, for instance, environmental sustainability, look the graph that is there in red color, which is quite low, we will try to understand why the city is not performing well in some specific indicators and dimensions. And when we do that, then we transform the indicators into possible policy interventions, some specific actions, some specific strategies, some forms of intervention that will help us to improve the city. And this is one of the examples in another city. We also do, with the CPI, a specific spatial analysis. And I don't have time to present this in detail, but this study, we did it in 200 cities in the world. And the major conclusion was that cities are, sorry for the misspelling there. For instance, talking about Asia, grew 3 times more, and Europe 3 times more the cities if compared with their populations. In other words, cities are expanding in their territories in terms of what is called urban sprawl, much more than population growth. And we have some interesting data. We analyzed 6 Russian cities. We will explain which ones. My pronunciation of them is not always very good. Tanya can help me with this. And in these 6 Russian cities, which are very big cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, but also very small cities, the constant is that cities, even in places where population is shrinking or reducing, cities continue to grow. And this is telling us that the growth of the cities is mostly because of some speculative factors associated to land, housing, etc. We did this study with Thomas Q University. We started, and you can see here, Berezhniki, how about Serchinsk, are 2 cities in Russia that are losing population, are having negative growth in terms of population, minus 1.2 and minus 1 every year in 25 years or 30, but still the city in terms of expansion continues to grow. Why this is affecting prosperity and sustainability? I will give you 5 very quick reasons. Number 1, when the city expands, you need to go farther to the periphery, and very often that generates inequalities in terms of social and economic access to the city. Number 2, infrastructure development in the periphery costs much more. Number 3, energy consumption is higher, much higher. Number 4, CO2 emissions are also much bigger in the city. And number 5, and very important, is that when you are having this kind of growth, more often than not, you are affecting the environment. In other words, this growth is taking place in protected areas or in other areas that could be. Now look at another 3 cities that, unlike the previous 2, the population growth was positive. Every year, 1.3, 1.5, 2% growth, but still the city continued to grow more than the population, except from St. Petersburg, that was basically the same. When these things are happening, there is a concomitant phenomenon or problem that is coming with the city. You expand the city, the population is not growing at the same level, so what is happening is that densities are reducing. And density is reduced in the first 2 small cities that I don't want to pronounce again. The reduction of population is 32%. 20 inhabitants per hectare as you are moving to the periphery. And in Moscow, in Tyumen and St. Petersburg, the reduction of the population in terms of densities or concentration is alarming in the expansion areas at 43, at 50 inhabitants per hectare. If you compare with the global average of densities in the world, we are talking about 90 inhabitants per hectare. In other words, these 3 cities are half of the global average. Economists told us in some econometric analysis that when the cities reach 60, 70 inhabitants per hectare, the provision of public goods like transport, public spaces, green areas, things that the government in principle should provide to the inhabitants are very difficult to maintain because you don't have the critical mass of people living in the area, and therefore you will need to subsidize these areas. And this is clearly a good indication that the space, the form of the city, can conspire against prosperity in some specific areas if you don't pay attention to these conditions. Another indicator, public space, which is measured through the City Prosperity Initiative. At the world level, in our analysis, public space measured through street density, street analysis, reduced from 25 to 21%. And we are saying, UN Habitat, if this thing allow me, that we should be at 30%. In other words, an optimal value is just an optimal value. It's not a perfect standard. If you want to have a good city in terms of connectivity, in terms of people, merchandise, goods moving from one place to the other, you should have something like 30% of different sizes of streets. We are not advocating for streets and cars. We are advocating for a structure of the city that can be some streets to walk, that are appropriated for the conditions of the city. But this is not happening. And these optimal values, for instance, in Moscow, reduced from 20, which was already 10% lower than the 30% value, to 50%. In other words, when you have this kind of reductions, it is clear, and Moscow, if you are from here, these perennial problems of transport and congestion are to large extent due to a lack of appropriate layout structure of the city. St. Petersburg is also reducing this. And sorry, this thing, it works whenever it wants. This is a very important data that I want. Arterial roads are the roads that have 18 meters or more. These roads are important for public transport, for infrastructure, for public spaces, to connect different parts of the city. At the world level, there was a reduction, but look, Moscow is a fascinating data. In the expansion areas of Moscow in the last 30 years, arterial roads passed from 25 to 3% only. And what happened with this is that if you live in the new expansion areas of the last 30 years, instead of walking 300 meters to take the bus or to go to an arterial road, you now need to walk more than 1 kilometer. And when you walk more than 1 kilometer, I can tell you that your city is not prosperous in that part of the area. It is generating some serious problems in this. And this is, Claudio, a general presentation. I will be happy to comment more on this. To tell you, as a conclusion, the city prosperity is the only index that is giving you indications of how cities are performing, how public policies are changing or not the city, and is giving us very good indication on how we can organize and rank cities in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. Now you see how we working at the global level, and now we coming down on Tatiana. What we would like you to answer is, how does this help or is adapted? How is it used at a national level in Russia? And then we'll bring down to the local level how our colleagues in Tomsky are working with that.
Yes, I speak in Russian. Спасибо, Claudio. Claudio, меня зовут...
Thank you, Claudio. My name is Tatiana Khabarova. I'm the head of Moscow Project Design Office on Habitat. And I want to draw your attention what we heard in the speech of Eduardo and Claudio in 2016 in a worldwide forum for the housing and sustainable development. New agenda was adopted. So the importance of this document was because it was taken in the conference which takes place, which is held once every 20 years. And after that, when they developed main mechanisms for the implementation, realization of this document, so at one of the first places of the significance was the city policy, because city policy is important on all levels, national, local, and on the level of the very city. But for this policy to be working, it should be founded on the proven data and understanding of the city. So talking about the city statistics, I guess that all people who gathered here, you know that on major city regions, we have some statistics. On settlements, town settlements, as we said yesterday at the seminar, we practically don't have the statistics. As for the spacious distribution in the cities, we don't have the statistic as well. And Eduardo was telling us in his presentation that initiative about which we're talking today is encouraging us not only to collect some statistics data, but to understand the city. And it's the a tool for development of the policy. So it's not just gathering of the data, but also education, training, and learning the best practices. And as of today, this initiative is working, and it's been tested in more than 400 cities. And however, it's a worldwide global initiative, but it works pretty fine on the local level. And our next speaker will tell us about that. Daria. And I hope that after Tomsk, we will have, besides Dzержinsk, Berezniki, other cities as well. And as the result, we will create this very important foundation for the development, both national city policy and local policies on the level of the regions of Russian Federation. Thank you very much.
To speak today about our joint project with the UN Habitat and National Research Tomsk State University. My name is Daria, and following to the principle think globally, act locally, I'm going to introduce today local implementation of the global agenda and a first full run pilot project for City Prosperity Initiative implemented in Russian Federation for the city of Tomsk. And being a local representative here, I would like to give a brief information about specific features of Tomsk as a pilot for City Prosperity Initiative implementation in Russia. You can see here where we are on the globe. You can see that we have nearly 600,000 of inhabitants in Tomsk, but what is the most specific about Tomsk is that we have 6 universities and every 4th resident of Tomsk is either studying or working at a university. And we have very high concentration of citizens with higher education and academic degree. We have large amount of students and young population in our city and quite high proportion of international students. National Research Tomsk State University was the first university not only in Tomsk, but in the Asian part of Russia, beyond the Urals. It was founded in 1878 as the first Siberian Imperial University. And we rank 277 in QS Best Universities ranking. And I forgot to mention that Tomsk is ranked 74th among best student cities in QS ranking. And today, TSU is staying classical university, combining tradition and innovation, and contributing to the development of human potential and prosperity, social prosperity. And getting closer to the point, why urban monitoring and measurement are important. The world is getting more and more urbanized today, with most of the global population and capital goods concentrated in urban areas. Cities are key to social development and economic prosperity, but at the same time, urbanization is one of the most consuming processes for the biosphere, and it leaves the largest ecological footprint. And today, experts and policymakers and society are building development strategies based on data that at least doesn't fully reflect the changing reality. Often, use of statistical quantitative data is closely connected with the prevailing policy discourse. Because, for example, GDP for decades was about the only benchmark to measure social and economic progress of the society. And I think that we need a tool to provide more holistic, more all-embracing, human-centered, human-oriented approach to analytical intelligence on the city scale, urban scale. And when we speak about measurement and monitoring of the urban performance and urban prosperity, we face with data availability. And when we are talking about social and economic performance data, Russian system of statistics is mostly aligned with the UN fundamental principles of official statistics. But at the municipal level, at the level of city entities, it can be quite challenging still to accumulate the relevant and reliable set of indicators and quantitative data comparing to the national scale. Spatial data is another context. Online urban planning maps are quite widespread in Russia. But in Tomsk, we have also pioneered the largest 3D model of the city, which is available online in open access. And it also acts as a 3D portal for engagement of the population in the processes of city planning. This city model was developed using drone technologies to facilitate the processes of urban environment digitalization. So we are becoming technology dependent, you see. Oh, here it is. What are the challenges for the Russian cities today? First of all, it is human capital migration, mostly towards central, western, and southern direction. People are searching for more favorable conditions in terms of external logistics, in terms of self-realization. We also deal with demographic aging of the population. Due to long-term decline of birth rate, now we are dealing with old age dependency for working age population. The urban infrastructure is also aging in terms of transport, water supply, sanitation, and so on. Also, many efforts are made in sphere of redevelopment, and here in Zaryadye Park we see a wonderful example of successful redevelopment, remodeling of the urban environment. But for the vast territories of Russia, we still observe outdated approach to redevelopment. Population is not really participating, is not really owning public spaces, and quite often social life is happening in private spaces, not in public spaces. And also non-equal distribution of investments among Russian cities is a problem. Facing to all of these challenges, tackling these problems demands for the tool which provides high level of analytical intelligence of the urban scale, enabling us to compare, to measure success and efficiency of the urban governance, not only on the national scale, but on the global scale, internationally. And CPI can be very successful in these tasks. Selected priorities of social and economic development in Russia can be grouped into following sectors: work with the human capital, efficient territorial policy, and efficient governance. And many successful efforts are already made in Russia. And all of this is accomplished according to triple helix approach, together with authorities, academia, and private sector, and even quadruple helix, because population is getting widely engaged into these processes. What we expecting from implementation of the CPI project in Tomsk? They think that it will help us to become globally compatible, to get the access to world best practices, to position ourselves in the global scale, to provide holistic approach to the urban governments and city planning, to define growth points and weak spots in our policy and strategy, and to get a sort of evidence-based decision-making tool for urban planning. So thank you for your attention, and you can contact us by the email which is on this slide.
Thank you very much. We have 10 minutes to finish our session, roughly, and I think this is a time you see from the global program that Eduardo Moreno shared with us, where we analyze, we validate, we create indicators, we prepare reports and action plans supported by evidence and by data. So the issue is, how do we measure that? The CPI provides this platform, which is not just a metric, but is a tool to provide feedback to policy, to improve performance in cities, and provide policymakers with levels of comparability. And I think we're having some lessons, and we're presented with very interesting data from Russian cities, proving what is being revealed in other parts of the world, that urbanization, the way it's being taking place, is not sustainable. So what do we do to revert this? So the partnership with the Atomics University is giving this avenue. Now, would you like to make a question, a comment during these last minutes of our session? This is now your turn to speak.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Of course, a lot of cities are now starting to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals, and I just wonder whether you can comment on how CPI and the SDGs can work together.
Yeah. Other question? So the SDGs and CPI.
Guy Eames. It looks like a wonderful model you have, really good for analytical model. How about then the implementation actually changes in the city? Is that connected with a sort of a similar tool, or is it all in one?
Right. Another question? 3 questions, and we give the floor to the panel.
In your first report about CPI, it was Moscow. And in the second report, it wasn't Moscow. And why?
Okay. So let's...
Thank you. 3 very relevant questions. CPI, like all these tools and applications, we have generations of CPI. So if you look, and that will somehow respond your question, if you look, the first CPI, it was not aligned at all with the SDGs, and neither, obviously, with Goal 11. The third version of the CPI is fully compliant with the indicators of Goal 11 and some other we call urban indicators of SDGs. So it's a metric that responds to the global agenda on sustainability completely today. For the same reason, when we do comparisons, we notice that with the new generation of the CPI, it will be misleading to say Moscow CPI in the first version was like this, and in the other year was like this, because in fact we were not talking exactly about the same tool, but some adjustments. That only explains the reason. Another reason is that when we conducted CPI evaluations, we did it at the beginning in cities that wanted to cover different parts of the world, but later on we work in countries and cities that requested the UN Habitat to work. In other words, in the last pool of cities, we didn't get a request from Moscow to work on this, if I'm frank with you. And the second question is a very relevant one, because CPI, and I hope you understand this, is not a blueprint. It's not something that we want that every city takes and adopts and uses. It has 2 versions. One, you can use this similar number of indicators and compare Moscow with Barcelona, with any other city in the world. But in reality, since what we want to do is to influence policy making, we understood that even inside countries, cities are different. For instance, when we work in Saudi Arabia, you have the capital Riyadh with several million of inhabitants. You have a small city, or you have Jeddah that is a port city. These cities have different challenges and different opportunities. Jeddah, which is a port, has environmental problems that the other cities do not have, and have economic opportunities that the other cities do not have. So what we do is we adapt the CPI to respond to the contextual needs of each city, and we call it expanded or contextual CPI, with losses in comparability, but gains in political deepness.
Any more questions? Any more questions from the audience?
I could speak Russian, okay?
I have a question to Daria. You said that Tomsk is the university city and it's in the rating on the place of number 37 in rating. So what is the implementation in terms of the green economy environmental changes? This very rating which I mentioned is the rating of the best student cities. So this city has been measured in terms of the attraction for the student. So that's why we don't consider economic criteria. We consider accessibility for the students to the training, to the education. So that's why we take pretty high place, and we are on the place 74, not 37. And Tomsk by itself is pretty green city, and we try to work on improvements in this regard.
We have time for one more question before we close. Anyone volunteer? No? Well, I think we had a very interesting session, particularly because we're trying to localize the tool called City Prosperity Index. And in that respect, I think the panel showed quite clear how we come from these global cities to localizing, having a program, and we hope that in Russia we'll expand that and create an initiative where we will be able to measure why certain policies are not working. But what Eduardo showed in the outcomes of the analysis of some Russian cities is about the trend we observe in urbanization. And the tool helps us to give the evidence. If cities are growing their land coverage in terms of urbanized area, more than twice the population growth, and even in cities where population is declining, then we need policies. We need to reverse this trend through very smart mechanisms to investment in housing and infrastructure, bringing densities to levels that is optimal, that makes the best use of public investment. And I think this is the beauty of this tool, to translate the metrics into spatial and policy implications. So I hope you enjoyed the session, and I give here a big applause to the panel.